Hello, and welcome everyone to this Boston Globe Women and Leadership Series Fireside Chat. I am Beena Venkatraman. I am the Boston Globe's editorial page editor, and I'm delighted to be with you all today and to welcome our extraordinary guest. Before I do that, just a few housekeeping notes. If you have questions during the conversation, you can put them into the Q&A. This event is being recorded, and a recording of it will be available to all registered guests after the fact. And I want to welcome and thank our sponsor, which is Ocean Spray. And there's a few remarks that are going to be made on behalf of our sponsor. The sponsor did not have any influence on the content of the conversation, but we're welcoming them to say a few words to you. This is Sarah Evans.
Thank you, Beena, and thank you to the Boston Globe for creating and hosting the Women in Leadership series. As the new Chief HR Officer at Ocean Spray, and in particular being new to the Boston area, it's wonderful and encouraging to have such a renowned institution like the Globe spearheading such important conversations. As many of you may know, Ocean Spray is a farmer-owned cooperative. It was founded in 1930 by 3 farmers. One of those was Elizabeth Lee, a woman who was more than ahead of her time. And at Ocean Spray, we continue to celebrate the principle that we are stronger when we're working together. For today's discussion, and threaded throughout this entire series, we've got brilliant, diverse, and passionate group of women gathered around that same notion: strength and learning together. It's what drew us to be part of this series and why it's such an honor to partner with the Boston Globe in championing women in leadership. Thank you again so much for the opportunity. I'm really looking forward to a wonderful conversation today. Back to you, Beena.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to Ocean Spray. I want to welcome Lauren Williams and introduce you to her. I am just so excited to be having this conversation on women in leadership with an extraordinary journalist and thinker, and someone I've been wanting to meet for a long time. So this is in a way just an excuse for me to get to know Lauren, but all of you will get to know her in the process. Lauren is currently the CEO, co-founder, and editor-in-chief of Capital B, which is a new forthcoming nonprofit news organization intended to aim at Black audiences. She's also the former editor-in-chief of Vox.com and the former senior vice president of Vox.com. So she's had an extraordinary career already to date in journalism. Hi, Lauren, it's great to see you.
Hi, wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's great that you're here. And I think this notion of women in leadership, and especially as it relates to leadership positions in journalism, is so live right now. We just heard that the Reuters editor-in-chief is for the first time a woman. There are women being elevated into these roles across media. But you, in many ways, I think that you were leading a nonprofit at a time when there weren't as many women. You were leading a news organization at a time when there weren't as many women doing that, and at Vox. And I want to get to that at some point. But first, I kind of just want to know, and I'm sure a lot of the viewers right now would like to know, how you came to become a journalist, how you came to see yourself as a journalist.
Yeah, I always loved writing growing up. That was something that I wanted to do. I didn't really know how I was going to apply that to a career necessarily. Even through college, I wasn't quite sure, but I stumbled into the first thing I tell you when you start to record a Zoom is to turn your phone off, and I didn't do that. I stumbled into an internship at a magazine and really got bitten by the bug, and ended up going to get my my master's in journalism. And started at a small newspaper in Virginia, and really just sort of ended up working in all sorts of different fields of journalism. Digital startups, I worked at AOL, I worked in Black media at The Root, and I ended up at Vox, where I started a couple of months after it launched. So it was a very, very new place, and it was kind of a leap for me to leave my previous job at Mother Jones to go there, but it felt like kind of like the future and something that was really interesting for me to try. It felt like they had there was a hole that needed filling, and I felt like I had the skills that they needed, and it ended up being like a really perfect move for me. And I ended up really growing there as a leader over the 6.5 years that I was there.
And so tell me more about that, because Vox, I think, just really became a force in the media during the time that you were there, with explainers, right? This idea of that there are so many complex topics in the news, whether they're policy topics, topics about the economy, race and history and technology, and that sometimes what people are looking for is not necessarily the latest incremental development in the news, but an explainer that really helps encapsulate what's going on. That I feel like has infected in a good way. I know we're in a pandemic, but there was a good sort of, I think, epidemic, a spreading of that kind of approach to journalism, even as sidebars among other mainstream news organizations, I think in part inspired by Vox. Tell me about when you were there, what your approach was to leadership. Here you are, a relatively young woman of color leading a new startup. They're prominent voices and faces of Vox that we know, like Ezra Klein, who now at the New York Times. But from what I understand and know, being your colleague in the industry, you were really orchestrating a lot of that success behind the scenes. So what was that like for you? What was your approach to being a leader? How did you kind of think about your own visibility? A lot of questions in there, but I'm curious about that time.
Well, the really interesting thing about working at a startup and being a part of something that's new and building is that there's no such thing as how it's always been. And, when you are starting at a new place, there is, just a combination of personalities and ideas and people that can work or not work, and you can fit in there or not fit in there. And I think at Vox, like I said before, it just sort of, there was a hole that I kind of fit into very, very well. And I was given a lot of space and freedom to make a lot of changes and steer the ship in sort of an organizational direction that made a lot of sense for the growth and the stabilization of the editorial organization. And we all worked together as a team to make this thing happen. And I think that that kind of alchemy doesn't always happen in organizations, and it really did at Vox. And we all kind of really had our strengths and recognized that in each other, and really, played off of it really well. And so, I think it was a place where I got to really flex my skills in the best way. And you get to really make a difference at startups. You get to, chart a course, because sometimes the legacy media, making changes is really, really difficult, because things
I have no idea what you're talking about.
I'm sure at the Boston Globe, you have no idea what I'm talking about. But we've done it this way for 50 years. So, it's really hard to go left if we've always gone right. This is an opportunity to really take a look at how the media has always done things and say, we're not going to do it like that. And it's okay.
Well, so you went to journalism school, and I know journalism school is to some degree evolving, but the sort of training of journalism school, and for that matter, Mother Jones magazine that's been around, sort of was oriented to print first, very different environment than the startup environment of Vox or the startup environment that you're creating now with capital B. I'm just curious, it's like, it seems to me, at least in your time in J school, they wouldn't have been teaching you the skills to be an entrepreneur and an innovator, or even necessarily a leader. I didn't go to journalism school myself, but I felt like a lot of my training in journalism was to be a better writer and line editor and thinker in terms of stories, but not in terms of how to be like a newsroom leader, or how to be an innovator, or how to, think about marshaling a vision and bringing people behind it. And all of that must be now in your skill set. based on what you've done and your track record with it, how did you kind of make that pivot from being a journalist and having that kind of training to doing this sort of more entrepreneurial and leadership work?
Yeah, nothing about journalism school teaches you about how to be a manager. There's just like no point in that where it's like one day you're going to have a big team and you're going to have to like know how to manage people's feelings and lead people, and do any of that. That's not really in the training. And I think some people want to do it and some people don't want to do it. And some people are good at it and some people aren't good at it. And it turns out that it's something that I really enjoy doing. And it was something that I wanted to cultivate in myself. And Vox, and prior to Mother Jones at The Root as well, where I was deputy editor, I sort of began to do this. It's something that I realized then was I was on the path towards wanting to be a newsroom leader and wanting to do more of this. And I worked at it, and you kind of, there aren't, of course there's management trainings but it really is the sort of job that you have to learn on the job. And every team is different and every person is different. And I think it's rather new, the idea of empathetic leadership. And some of that, you just kind of have to make a choice for yourself that you're going to be that kind of a leader, and model it.
Say more about that. What does empathetic leadership look like on a day-to-day basis, or in terms of how you think about hiring, or how you think about, your voice and how you use it in the world?
I don't know, when you think about when I think about when I was a younger person in the workforce, I was there to do a job and my boss was there to make sure that I did the job. And that was it. And, today there's a little bit more to it than that. Our lives are not our work. Our lives are not supposed to be just our work. Our lives are more important than our work. How do we balance those things? I'm a mother. I have 2 children. I know that the people that work for me have their own lives. I know that the news is emotionally draining to cover for my staff, for the women and the people of color on my staff, perhaps particularly. And so how do I think about that toll? And how do I think about running a newsroom in a way that doesn't treat workers like drones, but like human beings with real lives?
Yeah, I wish every leader had that perspective. It seems like the direction we need to go in as a society, let alone as leaders. So you made this leap recently from Vox, Vox having been built up to what it is, your 6.5 years there. And you're going to be starting something new. So it seems like you're jumping off the diving board again. And say more about why you decided to do that. Why for you, but then also what's the need that you think Capital B is going to serve?
Mm-hmm. So last June, there was so much happening at once. The Black Lives Matter protests across the country, the largest protest movement in the history of America. COVID was disproportionately killing Black and brown people. The election was kicking into gear. There were racial reckonings happening in newsrooms across the country. And as a newsroom leader who was also stuck at home like everyone else with my kids, trying to wrap my head around all of this, the confluence of all of those things just kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. And in trying to sort of wade my way through it, I connected with one of my very good friends who I worked with at the Root. Her name is Akoto Aforiata. And we thought about the skills, she's also a journalist, and we thought about the skills that we had gained since we had left the Root, where we were at the top of the masthead at our publications, and the skills that we had, and the audiences that were left behind in this incredibly important moment. And we felt like it was a moment where we had something to give to this audience, and we could serve a wide swath of people who were really left behind by the American news media. And so we decided that it was time to launch Capital B. And you asked me about journalism school not teaching like this kind of entrepreneurial spirit. I do think that they do much more of that now, but back then when I was there, they didn't. And I really did pick up on a lot of that from Vox. It's an incredibly entrepreneurial place. And I felt that, that spirit that Vox had really instilled in me a little bit, that, I could take that and bring it to Capital B and bring that sort of idea of explanatory journalism and the importance of that context to audiences in communities across the country that like literally don't get any news. And so that's how Capital B was born. And that's why I made the really tough decision to leave Vox in the middle of a pandemic and start a nonprofit. So that's why we're here.
And say more about this need that you don't think is being fulfilled by existing media. What exactly is that in terms of, what these audiences you think need and want and deserve?
So there are a few things going on at once. I mean, one of the one is that local news across the country is diminished. The local news business is, since in the last 15 years, local newspapers have shrunk by, I believe, a quarter. I believe half of American local journalists have disappeared. There are whole communities that don't get daily news or maybe any news at all. And you might imagine that this can affect marginalized communities the most. And so there's that part of it. And then the other part of it is even in places where there is daily news, the newspapers and the local TV stations have historically done very poor jobs covering communities of color in equitable ways, as evidenced by the testimony of many of the Black journalists who work in these newsrooms, who say, they've been shut out of coverage, or they have criticism of the way their stories have been edited, and the list goes on. And so even where there is news, the communities aren't being covered fairly, if they're being covered at all. And so there are many, many layers of neglect around the way that Black communities are covered by the news. And so that's really the need that Capital B wants to fill.
And so will you be making partnerships with organizations, media organizations, I'm thinking of the Boston Globe, where there is a real attempt now to try to cover communities of all different kinds, diverse communities with a lot more nuance and richness. Not, I think sometimes certain communities get focused on when there's an act of violence and not when there's, investment or a new business on a community. That's making a difference in a community, I should say. So, how do you see yourself as having a role in influencing how the mainstream existing media covers these communities, or do you see what you're doing as kind of serving them and sort of leaving aside that there's some failure that you've identified, and finding a way to just be more direct?
No, we see both. We want to partner with the local print media. We want to partner, many of these communities have, legacy Black newspapers that we want to partner with. We want to partner with the local mainstream newspapers. We want to reach the audiences, wherever we can. We also want to think about capital V as a place where Black journalists can come and be nurtured and learn and grow and potentially move on to work at mainstream news organizations. And having been reared in a newsroom that really has empowered them and trained them in a way that really values them and their perspectives and their skills. If there are capital B journalists in 10 years from now in newsrooms across the country, like that's a win for us, I think.
So there were a few questions that came in advance about your starting a nonprofit. And I think one of them comes from Mary Lighton, who asked, I'm also considering starting a nonprofit. What advice would you give to someone just starting out with a nonprofit who is not very familiar with this sector? So I'm wondering if you can address that one.
Yeah. So I was also not very familiar with this. I come from for-profit news. And my partner came from nonprofit news. So she's the one that comes with those skills. But the thing that we're deep in fundraising mode right now, and obviously that's one of the most important things in starting up a nonprofit is making sure that you can raise money. And the thing that's really helped us, and the thing that I think that you really need to identify as you're starting is that you have identified, the problem that you're trying to solve and why your nonprofit will work towards solving some slice of it. And that you're, sort of really definitive and confident about that, and that you can really sell that to funders is a really important part of getting out there.
Well, there's a related question that had come in. Lisa Lavina asks, or I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, what type of challenges did you encounter when looking for funding and capital? I know you're still in the process, but I am curious about that. And I think there are data to suggest that women, and I think women of color probably more so, face challenges when it comes to raising capital. And where's the money, whether you're talking about venture capital for-profit startups or philanthropic, there are sort of more networks of money and relationships that happen for men. So have you faced that challenge? How have you addressed it? Do you see shifts in that landscape at all?
So I like journalism. I'm pretty sure every industry had their reckoning last year. So philanthropy had their racial reckoning. And so if you go to any foundation website, like their main page has like a little racial equity section, like we care about this now section. But I think a very interesting ththing about big philanthropy is that there's so many barriers to reaching them. You can't really, a lot of them don't really appreciate or accept, cold emails or cold, unsolicited proposals. You kind of have to know someone in the institution to get in or have a meeting and so to me it's sort of like it's kind of like the enemy of equity in some ways, that you have to be connected to connect. And we're lucky in that we have we're working with the American Journalism Project, which is an organization that helps start up nonprofit journalism organizations, and they're giving us a lot of support. And we have a lot of connections. But I'm just thinking about if we had this great idea and talent, but didn't have that, we wouldn't have been able to raise any money or get any meetings, and it just wouldn't have happened. And so that is obviously a huge barrier, that to start an ambitious nonprofit, you have to already have a leg up in some way into like that world. And I guess another thing, and this is much more, I think focused on the journalism world specifically, is that a challenge is the question of sustainability. It's not just a question in the world of for-profit journalism, it's also a question in the world of nonprofit journalism. As you start this thing, are you going to be able to keep it going? It is tough to make a journalism business work. And most of the questions that we get are about how we're gonna make that happen. And so you have to be really, really smart about your business and your business plan and diversifying your revenue.
Yep. Makes a lot of sense. It's reminding me, I heard this piece on NPR's Marketplace Tech about a venture capital firm that invests in, technology companies, for-profit companies. And going back like a decade or so, this firm had decided to do what really doesn't happen in the world of VC, which is to say all of their funding gets filtered through a process that people apply for that funding on the website. So if you're a business that has some sort of personal connection, you still would have to go through that process, and everyone's business plan proposal gets looked at through that same filter. And as a result, there's this man reflecting on the last decade or so of investments. Their portfolio of companies is much more diverse in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of who's leading these companies that they've invested in, but no less successful financially than equivalent firms. And I think that's just such an interesting point that you made about having connections and intermediaries and people who can make that capital flow for you, help that flow for you, and how that's becomes such a sort of necessary but not sufficient condition for raising money for new ventures and for being truly innovative and creative. And to me, there's so many vibrant, creative ideas that can come from all different places. I mean, we know that immigrants have a long history of, starting up companies in this country. We know that women have incredible track records at coming up with interesting ideas. And if we're not tapping into all that because of these barriers, then we have a real problem as a society. We're starving ourselves of these great possibilities. And so, it's great to hear you name a couple intermediaries that have helped you. And obviously you were well established in some ways, in many ways, to get some of that access. Do you see any other, solution or need for more of those kind of intermediaries? Do you see more of them coming up? What's your view on that? I mean, you can disagree with me.
I absolutely, now that I'm in it, I absolutely see more of a need for that. I don't know that outside of, I'm so steeped in journalism that that's kind of all that I know of. I know there's now the Tiny News Collective, which is basically a fund to help start up basically, micro local news organizations, and you don't have to have any experience and they don't put you through the ringer. You just have to have a good idea and you can apply for funding, which is really cool. And there's some other opportunities like that, but yeah, I mean, after kind of being in it and seeing how difficult it is to start up something, I really, really do.
So I know we have more questions. We're going to eventually take more questions from the audience, but there's another one that came in advance, and it has to do, I'm going to paraphrase this question. It has to do with there being a vast media landscape out there, and newer, smaller outlets, as well as larger traditional ones. And the question is coming from a news consumer and asking, how to be basically savvy at navigating this complicated landscape and knowing where you can get both useful and interesting information. So it's a kind of a big question, but I am curious what your thinking is about this, like how you view this whole information ecosystem we're living in.
I definitely, I definitely do not think that we are living in a I don't know, I'm trying to figure out how to word this. I think the New York Times would probably be happy if like you only went to the New York Times, right? And maybe you could get away with that a little bit and just sort of kind of, you know, understand what's going on. But I think that having a really diverse set of a really kind of diverse news diet is really important. And whether that is, you know, having a handful of places that you follow on, that you curate yourself on, like Apple News or on Twitter or on Facebook or, you know, whatever social media you use, or what, you know, I think that you should definitely like curate, but I also think that you should look at a variety, because I think that perspective is important, and I definitely think that that local perspectives are really important. You know, one of the things that I was making sure to do yesterday was to read some local media about what was happening in Brooklyn Center in Minnesota. There is a local nonprofit news organization called Seihan Journal that I was reading, and it's just different than what you're reading about from the bigger news organizations, and that's an important perspective. And you just have to remain curious about how you know, the different news organizations are going to cover a thing, and it's really helpful to see the nuance in it.
I totally agree with that. I did want to talk to you about what's going on in Brooklyn Center. So we have a situation where this police officer fatally shot a young man, 20-year-old man, Black man, and, you know, protests that are happening, responding to that. At the same time that the Chauvin trial is still happening, you know, the man who killed George Floyd, the former police officer who killed George Floyd, is on trial for murder. How would Capital B go about covering this differently than what we're seeing? I mean, I think we're seeing a range of ways that media are approaching covering these issues, but do you see like a clear kind of like contrast with what your vision is of how, once you're up and running, you would be approaching what's happening?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, one of the things that is going to be very different about Capital B in terms of, you know, just the way that we are focusing our coverage is just that we're not we're just centering a different audience. You know, we are focusing our coverage for a Black audience, and so it may not be a different set of you know, information necessarily, but the way that we are writing about it, and the way that we are you know, framing our story, and the context that we're bringing in is not sort of like, you know, we don't need to, you know, explain racism or how racism works or, you know, whatever. You know, we're bringing in the context that's going to most matter to the group of people who are reading this work. And that's how, you know, it's going to, you know, I can't think of the specific way that it might differ, but when you center a Black audience, it's not necessarily going to be the same as when you're writing for, you know, everyone.
And do you see that also in terms of the types of issues you cover? So I feel my own assessment, being an editor and an opinion editor, which is very different than being, you know, someone who chooses what news gets covered. But that, you know, a lot of the racial justice coverage, that's obviously a lot of it has emerged with the killing of George Floyd. And as you were talking about all the events of last summer, and the awareness that's come to everywhere from philanthropy to corporate America. But that kind of coverage where it's incident driven, where we're focusing on these acts of police violence and then talking about, we have this ongoing problem with racism in this country as evidenced in this particular incident, and then having people comment on that, I think is, while it's important, is only one slice of the coverage about, for one, racial justice, but it's only one slice of the potential coverage of communities of color, of issues, of all kinds of things. And so that seems to me part of the potential of what you're doing. It's part of the exciting potential of what you're doing. So as you think about like setting the table for what kinds of issues need to be covered beyond police violence, do you have a sense of, what those focus areas need to be? Is it too early to say?
So our primary focus areas are going to be health, education, criminal justice and safety, politics, and housing and economics. And did I say politics? Yes. So we sort of feel like all the biggest and most impactful stories kind of circle around those issues. And we'll cover those stories with investigative and accountability journalism nationally. And locally, those are going to be sort of our core beats. But depending on the location, some of them will be maybe, more important and more salient than others. And there may be some that are not on that list that may be incredibly important given some sort of characteristic of the city. But those are sort of the core beats that we are always going to include in capital B.
It's interesting. So if you're covering the economy, for example, and you're centering Black audiences, do you have thoughts about like, what are the kinds of stories that, would emerge from that maybe we aren't seeing in mainstream media? Or even maybe examples you've seen in mainstream media that are the example of the kind of things you'd be doing more of, or amplifying more, or going deeper on?
Well, I don't know if I have, it's early stages. I don't know if I have exact story ideas yet, but, we want to cover, the wealth gap. We want to cover, Black unemployment and Black employment. We want to cover, Black business owners and Black small business. We want to really focus on, every aspect of stories of the economy as they intersect with Black Americans, and just put a razor focus on Black communities across the country and the economy.
So I recognize I'm geeking out with you a little bit on the journalism, and that maybe people are really interested in women in leadership more broadly as they're tuning into this. But I do think it intersects in that I'm wondering how you're thinking about the coverage of women and the coverage of women in the existing framework of the media. Obviously, it's changed. Obviously, I think it's gotten a lot better than it was, which is always like, sort of a way of saying we're not where we need to be, but we're not in the 1950s when, they didn't even put women on television unless it was a beauty pageant. So, what do you think of when you think about the coverage that Capital B will have in terms of how women, how women feature as sources, women feature as the subject of stories, that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. Well, we have two women co-founders. It is going to be, coverage of Black women is going to be really just sort of ingrained in every story that we do. And, one of the things that is very near and dear to us when we talk about our coverage and we're thinking about our coverage is Black women in health is a huge topic that, we are going to definitely invest a lot of our resources in. Black women in politics, Black women in political power, Black women organizing. That is an enormous story. it's hard to kind of separate Black women from any of the topics that I've listed. When we talk about public safety in Black communities, that's a Black woman story. Like it's just going to be part and parcel in the fabric of capital B's coverage.
That's really exciting. It makes me think you're going to have a lot of surprising profiles and, just really rich textured stories. I feel like there's so many untold stories out there. And even I think, if I can editorialize a little bit here, as I want to do, I just think your story is so interesting as it relates to Vox. I think a lot more people know Ezra's story, for example, but there are all these stories of like really interesting people who are behind, whether it's a business or whether it's community change, that have, I think, historically gone untold. And I think we're depriving ourselves of something when we don't tell these stories and talk to these people. So there are a couple more questions that are coming in live, and I'm going to encourage everyone at this point to, if you have a question, put it into the Q&A. This is a great question. So did you have any fears of failure that capital B would not be well received or supported? If so, how did you overcome those fears to launch?
Yes. That's an interesting segue from talking about me being behind the scenes to this, because, there is some comfort in being behind the scenes. And I think that, I would be lying if I didn't say that as a Black woman, I have had a lot of, I probably have an elevated fear of failing and of failing and not getting a second chance. And maybe that's been part of the reason why I've always been very comfortable, being behind the scenes. And this was a big leap for me, not just in that it's scary to step out there and start a new thing, but step out there and be sort of the public face of a new thing that could crash and burn, is terrifying, because what if people like me don't get a second chance? So yeah, I'm still scared because it hasn't launched yet. But if people like me don't do things like this, that's an enormous problem too. I think that it's an incredibly important project, and I believe in it, and so it's worth it. But yeah, no, I'm definitely terrified every day.
There's so much depth in that answer. It's both the way who we tolerate failures from, right? Like, in whose entrepreneurial stories, like, is failure okay? I feel like it needs to be okay in everyone's story and everyone's career trajectory, because any interesting career involves failure. Exactly. But also what you're saying about that sort of extra internalized fear that you have that has in a way reinforced you taking a step back from the limelight of the initiatives you've been behind. It's super interesting. Okay, so a couple more questions here. So what did you think was your most important experience, maybe a specific memory, in helping you learn how to be a successful manager? That's a great question.
I'm not sure if this is the most important, but this is a moment that comes to mind is early on in Vox. I actually think I'd only been there for 2 months when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson happened. And, I was still kind of like learning the ropes, and the background of Vox was that Ezra Klein and Melissa Bell both worked at the Washington Post, and basically Ezra took almost his whole team from the Washington Post with him to Vox. So everyone knew each other. And most everyone knew each other. There were a handful of other people who didn't, but it was a close knit group, and I did not really know anyone. And I kind of hadn't found my place on the team yet. And, when Ferguson happened, we didn't really have anyone to cover it. And it was no one's, didn't really intersect with anyone's specialty. We didn't have anyone covering criminal justice, but we had some people who were interested in it. And we had some people who were attorneys on the team. And so I just sort of like corralled a group, and we formed like a team, and I led the team and, ran coverage, and we did some really, really interesting and fascinating work that kind of, I think solidified in some ways, how we would do sort of explainers on breaking news events, and I think it was just a moment for me that I think helped, one, my confidence as a manager, and helped sort of solidify my place in the organization. And it was I think it was a turning point in my career at Vox, which ended up just being a turning point in my career. That was really important.
Something you said, I just want to pick up on, because it sort of relates to something you were saying before about finding that you filled a specific hole at Vox, but you just talked about being in this like sort of period of limbo where you didn't really know where your role was in the organization. And I imagine that is something that a lot of women can relate to, and in particular, people who've worked in startups, women, men, others, non-binary people, that, if you kind of jump into something on the ground floor, you don't always know exactly what your role is and how you can be most useful. And there's this time of like sort of uncertainty. Is it just your personality to be kind of comfortable in that state of limbo, or did you have to do something, or did something help you to be able to sort of navigate that and get to the place where you're like, oh, this is how I can be a leader in this organization?
Yeah, no, it's not my personality. This one is really good that it was really good that this moment happened, because I think I may have still been in limbo.
Yeah.
And it's especially, I think this is especially true at startups, because startups are not by nature just not organized. Like HR is kind of iffy, and there's not like a real onboarding process, and everyone is so busy. And yeah, you kind of have to, you do kind of have to dive in. And that's not necessarily all, I'm, particularly at that point, like not necessarily, me, and you just kind of have to do it. And that a news story kind of forced me, a news story that was very important to me, that the place where I was working got right, forced me into it. But yeah, no, it's really, really tough to find your place in a place, basically like the train's moving at a really fast speed, and you have to find like where you can hop on it, and that's tough.
Yeah. That's reminding me, there was another question that came up that sort of relates to this memory experience, but it was an advanced question from Monique Stewart, and she asked what resources, people, experiences, I think you answered one on the experience, were pivotal in helping you move up the career ladder to your current position. So I don't know if you want to say more about resources or people that have helped you, or other experiences.
I think it's it's so important to have a cohort of peers. And I know that everyone, the thing is, people always want to talk about mentors, and I think mentors are nice, but for me, I always feel like it's always like I'm bothering my mentor. That's how I always felt when I was, a more junior person. But when you have your cohort of peers, it's like they're your friends, and you can bounce ideas off them. You can share salaries with them. You can, rehearse your request for a promotion speech. You can send them, the email you're about to send to your boss. You can, shoot them your story to read before you send to your editor. You can do all kinds of things. And I can't recommend enough that if you don't have that group of peers in your line of work, like cultivate it, for like find that text group or email chain or whatever and make it happen, because to me it's so much more important than mentors.
That's so interesting. And it also makes me wonder, like, sometimes that's not so obvious to find. Like, it's easy when you're in the newsroom, like in like sort of a certain stage of your career, to find your peers because they're literally have the same job title and sit next to you. But when you're in charge, when you're a leader, like, how do you find those people? What have you done to figure out like who are your peers, right? Because when you're running the newsroom, that's not as obvious.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I had just have a long-standing kind of crew, but something that it's interesting, like when I was promoted to editor-in-chief of Vox, like some other women editors-in-chief reached out to me and they were like, well, welcome to the club. And I now do that to others who are promoted, like just to say, like, I'm here. There are not that many of us. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. And, offering yourself up in that way is a way to kind of pay it forward for like a new, a new group of people who are going to be in the same position.
That's really exciting. Yeah, and it's a good way. Offering yourself up is a good way to also have
the
ricochet
back. You can back. And
yeah.
Last summer was a really hard time to run a newsroom or to be in charge of a department. And it was we all needed each other.
Yeah. Could say that again. Okay, here's a good one. What advice do you have to encourage other women of color to speak up in the moment? So I'm not sure if in the moment means in the moment when something they need to resist something, but I think there's different ways of interpreting it, all of which seem interesting to me. I think there are a lot of times when women of color kind of like bite their tongues when there's some discussion and, they have a lot to say on the topic or something. But then I think there's also these moments where something maybe happens that's not quite right. So I'm not sure which is meant here.
I mean, if it's the latter, I honestly, I'm a person who sometimes in the moment is not the best time for me to speak up. I get, I may get too emotional or I don't, sometimes the spoken word is not my best form of communication. Sometimes I will say it so much better in an email than I will say it in conversation. And I know that about myself. And so I will wait and send an email after the meeting and know that I will communicate that better than I would have in conversation. I think that there's a lot of, I want us to kind of free ourselves from the pressure of of necessarily like speaking up in the moment. Like that is the only way to get anything done or make ourselves heard. I think the more important thing is to communicate in the most effective way that you know how to communicate. And if that's going to be in the moment, then you should do it then. If it's going to be, asking for a one-on-one when it's not in front of a crowd of people, then it's that. If that's an email, then it's that. And I think that the thing that is most important is that you are setting yourself up for being the most effective communicator of difficult concepts and conversations.
Super helpful. I want to just say thank you so much, Lauren Williams. You've been a fantastic interlocutor and just a great person and leader to have as part of this series. The whole Globe community thanks you. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And to close us out, Sarah Evans from Ocean Spray is just going to say a few words, and thank you to Sarah too.
Thank you.
No, thank you, Bina, Lauren. I can't begin to tell you how much I appreciated this hour, and just not just for an inspirational talk, but an authentic conversation. I'm so impressed by you and just absolutely encouraged by the wonderful things that are going to be coming from you. And, especially this notion of paying it forward, it really screams we are stronger together. Most importantly, you've taken world challenges and taken action to start a really ambitious nonprofit that will make a difference. I love the inclusion that you have demonstrated throughout your career, both that you experienced at Vox and that you're continuing to develop. I think that's something that's going to enable people to do their best work. But most importantly, I loved the component where you shared about empathetic leadership and how important it is today. And that's something that I'm going to walk away more inspired to focus on at Ocean Spray. So again, on behalf of Ocean Spray and all of our women leaders and teammates, it's an honor to partner with the Globe on today's event, and many, many thanks for everybody for participating. Thank you.